small voice came in the night and said, "Go." And when I put it up to the boss, he leaned back in his chair and said, "Go." And when I sat alone with my conscience and asked it what to do, it pointed and said, "Go." So, I'm on my way to London. Never before have I set out on a long trip with anything but elation in my heart. It is not so with this trip. This one is no lark. It'll be tough, and I know it. I will be scared. I will feel small and in the way among people who are doing a job of life and death. My very first impression of England was of lovely, courteous people. Everywhere you go, people are nice to you. In my first few days here, I have met an enormous number of people, and the first thing everyone says, and I've heard it 200 times, is this: "Is it better or worse than you thought it would be?" Then I have to explain to them that in the United States, we had felt that perhaps, because of the censorship, we might not be getting a complete picture of the devastation. We had been afraid that London was more grievously wounded than we were being allowed to know. And now, having been prepared for any shock, and having looked at London, I can truthfully answer that it is better off than I had expected. London is not gravely injured, not in its architecture, or its utilities, or its transportation, or its health, and above all, not in its spirit. London is no more knocked out than the man who smashes a finger is dead. So far, the Blitz on London is a failure. Now, my first 2 days were consumed in getting signed up and identified. First, you register with the police and get a booklet with your picture in it. Then there is the national registration. Here you get another booklet, and don't you lose it. Then you get your food ration book. Then you report to the Ministry of Information and get a pass with your picture on it, and then additional cards permitting you to stay out after midnight and enter prohibited areas, zones of military action. Now, I have so many papers that I've had to buy an extra wallet. So big, I have to carry it in a side pocket, and it's already stuffed full. At the police station, it took half an hour to get my business done because a policeman had to tell me about the bombs in his neighborhood. He said the night before I had arrived, a bomb had hit his block and wiped out 13 houses. But only 5 people were hurt. Nobody was killed. Imagine bombing a quiet, homey suburb like ours, he said. Now, what military advantage could that possibly have? Well, I said, I suppose the point is to try to break the spirit of the people. And he said, not boastfully, but in an ordinary tone, well, I guess so, but actually, it's having just the opposite effect. I asked him if he had a backyard shelter. He said he did, but he never went into it. He preferred to sleep in his own bed, get a good rest, and take his chances. On my second afternoon, I got a haircut. The barber talked all the time, and for once, I enjoyed it. These Londoners can tell an American a mile off. It didn't take the barber long to find out that I had just arrived, and that my first 2 nights in London had passed without a single bomb being dropped. He said before many nights, we'd have some. And I'll tell you, he said, if you don't get a little windy your first night, then you're not much of a man. Just an animal with no nerves in his body. I told the barber I was all prepared to be London's biggest coward. He said not to be ashamed if I got scared and did something silly. I'm glad I got a haircut. That barber was a great solace. Before that talk, I'd been afraid of bombs and also afraid to have anybody know I was afraid. Now, I'm only afraid of bombs. London is December 30th, 1940. Someday, when peace has returned to this odd world, I want to come to London again and stand on a certain balcony on a moonlit night and look down upon the peaceful silver curve of the Thames with its dark bridges. And standing there, I want to tell somebody who has never seen it how London looked on a certain night of the holiday season of the year 1940, when London was ringed and stabbed with fires. On that night, this old, old city, even though I must bite my tongue in shame for saying it, was the most beautiful sight I've ever seen. They came just after dark. Shortly after the sirens wailed, I could hear the Germans grinding overhead. And somehow I could sense from the quick, bitter firing of the guns that there was to be no monkey business this night. In my room, with its black curtains drawn across the windows, you could feel the shake from the guns. You could hear the boom, crump, crump, crump of heavy bombs tearing buildings apart. They were not far away. I gathered a couple of friends and went up to a high, darkened balcony that gave us a view of 1/3 of the entire circle of London. As we stepped out onto the balcony, a vast inner excitement came over us that had neither fear nor horror in it because it was too full of awe. About every 2 minutes, a new wave of planes would be over. Their motors seemed to grind rather than roar, and to have an angry pulsation like a bee buzzing in blind fury. The bombs were intermittent, sometimes a few seconds apart, sometimes a minute or more. Their sound was sharp when nearby, soft and muffled far away. Into the dark spaces below us, whole batches of incendiary bombs fell. We saw 24 go off in 2 seconds. They flashed terrifically, then simmered down to pinpoints of dazzling white, burning ferociously, and a yellow flame would leap up from the white center. Another building was on fire. Now, you have all seen big fires, but I doubt if you've ever seen the whole horizon of a city lined with fires. Scores of them, hundreds. The closest were near enough for us to hear the crackling flames and the yells of firemen. Little fires grew into big ones died down under the firemen's valor, only to break out again. The greatest of all the fires was directly in front of us. Flames seemed to whip hundreds of feet into the air. Pinkish white smoke ballooned upward in a great cloud, and out of this cloud, there gradually took shape, so faintly at first that we weren't sure we saw correctly, the gigantic dome and spires of St. Paul's Cathedral. It stood there in its enormous proportions, like some miraculous figure that appears before peace-hungry soldiers on a battlefield, growing slowly clearer and clearer, the way objects take shape at dawn. St. Paul's was surrounded by fires, but it came through. I shall always remember, above all the other things in my life, the monstrous loveliness of London on a holiday night, stabbed with fires, shaken by explosions, sparkling with the pinpoints of white-hot bombs, roofed over with a ceiling of paint that held bursting shells, flares, and the grind of vicious engines. The most hateful, most beautiful single scene I've ever known. And the excitement and anticipation and wonder in your soul that this could be happening at all. The air war is picking up. There is a lot of sudden dying in London every night. hit and skip dying, death dealt by mystic lottery. "3 miles above, in the dark, a lone bomber lets one loose. That bomb will hit some small spot in a big area 30 miles across. From among London's 8 million people, it will pick out some doomed handful. Until it hits, nobody knows. Out of the 8 million, 10 may die tonight. Now, what marked those 10 to be drawn in the lottery instead of us? What fate drew a bomb to their special 100 square feet? My room is the same size as theirs. Why didn't it come here?" There is no answer. The war is not dramatic to the British people. They go from day to day and take care of whatever happens. There's no fury, no frenzy, no great hatred, no general fear, no fanaticism. There's no feeling of stringency or acuteness in daily life. Faces appear the same as in peacetime. Of course, I would like to say that everybody was made of steel, that nobody ever got scared or panicky, but I have run into people who were petrified by bombs. I have one friend who loses several pounds during every bad raid. I've been in some badly blitzed places where spirits were getting pretty low, and people were wondering just how much more they could take. I've found a good many stories of selfishness and of running away by people who could afford to run away. But none of these is expressive of the national character. In 3 months, I have not met an Englishman to whom it has ever occurred that Britain might lose the war. What you've read in the papers back home about their courage and calmness as a nation is absolutely true. Maybe there is something that would break them, but it hasn't come yet. Now it is time to go. It is not easy to leave. Spring comes early in England, and it is a lovely thing. Already the days are soft and gentle. I've been around to say my goodbyes, and I have told them all it was not goodbye forever, that I would be back. Shortly after arriving in Africa, I happened on a friend I didn't know I had. I spent some time with the Army's Medical Corps in the Oran area, where our first heavy casualties occurred. Our doctors and nurses and medical aides had had their first battle experience and had covered themselves with glory. The wounded had nothing but praise for those who pulled them through. Our only deaths in the original occupation were those killed outright and those so badly wounded that nothing could have saved them. In other words, we lost almost nobody from infection or from medical shortcomings in the hurly-burly of battle. When I first visited them, 5 big hospitals were going full blast. 3 were French hospitals taken over by the Army. 1 was an abandoned French barracks turned into a hospital, and 1 was a huge tent hospital out in an oat field. On one of my first tours of inspection, a nurse in an old blue sweater came walking down a muddy street. An Army pal yelled at her and introduced me. And the nurse said, "Well, at last. I never expected to meet you here. I've been saving sugar for you for 2 years." I had never seen the nurse before in my life, so a little inquiring about the sugar business was necessary. Mary Ann Sullivan was a former surgical supervisor in Boston City Hospital. She and her sister nurses were reading my reports 2 years ago when I was in London and complaining in the public prints about not getting enough sugar. So the nurses felt sorry for me and started saving sugar. Whenever a cube was left over, they would save it and say, "This one's for Ernie." Then in the summer of 1941, these nurses joined a Harvard unit and set sail for England, and they carried with them that sugar, especially earmarked for me. But their motive came to naught. The Germans torpedoed their ship, and my sugar went to the bottom of the Atlantic. The nurses were eventually picked up and taken to Iceland and England, and finally to Africa. Mary Ann Sullivan's unit came ashore the first morning of the landings. They operated on wounded men for hours, with snipers' bullets pinging on the walls. It was just the kind of life Mary Ann had been waiting for. She was so steamed up she could hardly wait for the next battle. I arranged officially with headquarters to be wounded in Mary Ann's vicinity. When I met her, she was with a mobile surgical truck, which she called the Super Commando truck. It was equipped to rush into the thick of things, slam on the brakes, and operate on wounded men for 36 hours without replenishments. And there we were. And wasn't it a small world, after all, even if my sugar was gone? Mary Ann felt badly about my sugar being sunk, but she did break out a hospitable commodity, which both censorship and the ethics of war forbid me to mention. So our meeting was not without a certain rare delicacy to put in our mouths. In June 1943, when our military forces began fitting the war correspondents into the great Sicilian invasion patchwork, most of us were given the choice of the type of assignment we wanted. Since I had never had the opportunity to serve with the Navy, I requested the invasion fleet. My request was approved. I was assigned to a headquarters ship. She was not huge, just big enough so that we could feel self-respecting about our part in the invasion, and yet small enough to be intimate. I got to know a great many of the sailors personally, and almost all of them by nodding acquaintance. I found them to be just people, fundamentally friendly. They were willing to do everything they could to win the war, but they all wanted to get home. Now, the Sicilian invasion was the first violent action for most of its crew. Only 3 or 4 men who had been torpedoed in the Pacific had had any close association with the probability of sudden death. The sailors went into action just as soldiers go into the first battle, outwardly calm, but inside frightened and sick with worry. One of the nights before we sailed, I sat in the darkness on the forward deck, helping half a dozen sailors eat a can of stolen pineapple. Some of the men of the group were hardened and mature. Others were almost children. They all talked seriously, and their gravity was touching. The older ones tried to rationalize how the law of averages made it unlikely that our ship, out of all the hundreds involved, would be hit. The younger ones spoke little. They talked of their plans and hopes for going to college, getting married after the war, but always winding up with, if I get through this alive. As we sat there on the hard deck, squatting like Indians in a circle around our pineapple can, even the dizziest of us knew that before long, many of us stood an excellent chance of being in this world no more. I don't believe one of us was afraid of the physical part of dying. That isn't the way it is. The emotion is one of almost desperate reluctance to give up the future. Going to college, staying in the Navy for a career, seeing the old lady again, holding on your knee just once your own kid whom you've never seen, driving a coal truck around the streets of Kansas City, sitting in the sun once more on the south side of a house in New Mexico. It was these little hopes and ambitions that made up the sum total of our worry at leaving, rather than any visualization of physical agony to come. Now, I suppose that's splitting hairs, and that it really all comes under the heading of fear. Yet somehow there is a difference. I never heard anybody say anything patriotic. There was philosophizing, but it was simple and undramatic. Now, I'm sure if he'd been given the chance, no man would have stayed ashore. There was something in him bigger than the awful dread that would have made him want to stay safe on land. With me, that something was probably an irresistible egoism in seeing myself part of an historic naval movement. But with others, I think it was just plain, unspoken, even unrecognized patriotism. Now, the ship's officers were told the whole invasion plan just after we sailed. The first morning out, the sailors were called out on deck and told where we were going. I stood with them as they got the news. A mimeographed set of instructions and warnings was distributed. This operation will be a completely offensive one. The ship will be at general quarters or condition 2 throughout the operation. Opportunities for rest will not come very often. You can be sure that you will have something to talk about when this is over. This ship must do her stuff. General quarters is the Navy term for full alert. It means that everybody is on full duty until the crisis ends. It may be 20 minutes. It may be 48 hours. Condition 2 is half alert. 4 hours on, 4 hours off, but the off hours are spent right at the battle station. Merely gives the men a little chance to relax. Throughout the invasion period, the entire crew was either on general quarters or condition 2.
General quarters, all hands man your battle stations, all hands man your battle stations.
The very night our ship got her baptism of fire. As the sailors put it, she lost her virginity. Around 4 o'clock, general quarters sounded. It was still pitch dark. The whole ship came to life with a scurry and a rattling, sailors dashing to stations before you'd have thought they could get their shoes on. Shooting had started around the harbor. We knew this time it was real. The biggest guns on our ship let loose. They made such a horrifying noise, we thought we'd been hit by a bomb. Dust and debris came drifting down. One by one, the electric light bulbs were shattered. The thick steel bulkheads of the cabin shook and rattled. The entire vessel shivered under each blast. The fight went on for an hour and a half. Our kids on the ship had never before been in action. The majority of them were strictly wartime sailors, still half civilian in character. They'd never been shot at, had never shot one of their own guns, except in practice. And then, within an hour and a half, they became veterans. Boys who had been all butterfingers were loading shells like machinery. Boys who had gone through their routine lifelessly yelled with bitter seriousness, "Damn it! Can't you pass those shells faster?" When it was over and everything was added up, we found our ship had suffered no damage except small holes from near misses. 4 planes had been wounded. And best of all, we were credited with shooting down one of the planes. The gunnery officer, making his official report to the captain, did it in these gleefully robust words: "Sir, we got the son of a bitch." This particular raid was only one of scores of thousands in this war. Standing alone, it wouldn't even be worth describing. I'm mentioning it to show you what a taste of the genuine thing can do for a bunch of young Americans. Now, you can't realize how nearly impossible it is to arrive with a convoy in the dead of night, feel your way in through the darkness, pick out the designated pinpoint on an utterly strange shoreline, and then put a ship safely ashore at exactly the right spot. In our sector, every ship hit every beach just right. They tell me it was the first time in history that such a thing had ever been accomplished. Now, on our ship, it seemed that all hell was breaking loose ashore. But later, when I look back on it, it didn't seem so very dramatic. Most of our section of coast was fairly easy to take. We had expected a terrific slaughter on the beaches, and there was none. Instead of thousands of casualties along the 14-mile front, the total was astonishingly small. It had all been so easy. We had the jumpy, insecure feeling of something dreadfully wrong somewhere. Now, when daylight came, we looked from the boat deck across the water, and we could see the American flag flying from the top of a fort on a hill directly behind Licata. Although the city itself had not yet surrendered, some rangers had climbed up there and hoisted the flag. Well, I couldn't resist the chance to see what it was like on land, so about 6 hours after our first troops had landed, I hopped an assault barge and went ashore. The thing, apparently, was a complete surprise. The enemy defenses are almost childish. Only a few mines on the beaches, practically no barbed wire. They didn't bother to mess up their harbor or blow out the river bridges, which would have cut our forces in half. We had come prepared to fight our way through a solid wall of mines, machine guns, artillery, barbed wire, and liquid fire. We even expected to hit some fiendish new devices, yet there was almost nothing to it. It was like stepping in the ring to meet Joe Louis and finding Caspar milk toast. Our troops had been trained to such a point that instead of being pleased with no opposition, they were thoroughly annoyed. I talked with one ranger who had been through Dieppe and other tough battles, and he said Sicily was by far the easiest of all. It left him jumpy and nervous to get trained to razor edge and then have the job fizzle out. Poor guy, he was sore about it. That ranger was Sergeant Morrell White, a friendly blond fellow from Middlesbrough, Kentucky. He'd been overseas a year and a half. Back home, he had a wife and a 5-year-old daughter. He used to run his uncle's bar in Middlesbrough. He said when the war was over, he was going to drink the bar dry and then just settle down behind it for the rest of his life. Now, in wartime, it is an axiom that the closer you get to the front, the less you know about what is going on. We would often say to each other, we wish we were back in New York so we could find out how we were doing. During the first 2 days, we had no word at all about the 2 American sectors to our right. Even though we were within sight and sound of their gunfire, we knew nothing about how they were faring. The people in America knew, but we didn't. Now, on board ship, we were somewhat better off than the troops on land because we did get some news by radio. Every night throughout our invasion, we listened to the Berlin broadcasts and to the special propaganda program directed at American troops. A purported American, Midge, nicknamed Olga by the boys, worked hard at her job. She tried to tell them that while they were overseas fighting a phony war for the Jewish Roosevelt, their sweethearts would marry somebody else, and there would be no jobs for them when they got home. The boys listened to her partly to get mad, partly because the program always had excellent music, and partly to get a laugh. Now, Olga had a come-hither voice, and she spoke straight American. Every night I'd hear the boys conjecturing about what she looked like. Some thought she was probably an old hag with a fat face and peroxide hair, but the majority liked to visualize her as looking as gorgeous as she sounded. The most frequently expressed opinion was that if they ever got to Berlin, they'd like to sock Olga on the chin and then make love to her. Now, by the end of the first week after the Sicilian invasion, the watches dropped down to Condition 3, almost peacetime regime. The ship's laundry reopened. Liberty parties were led ashore for sightseeing. I knew then that for our ship's family in that special phase, the war was over. So I shouldered my barracks bags and trundled myself ashore in Sicily for good. Those few weeks with the Navy had been grand, and I hated to part from the friends I had made. And yet, in a perverse way, I looked forward to going back to the old soldier's routine, sleeping on the ground, not washing before breakfast, and fighting off fleas. Man is a funny creature. Moved on with the 3rd Division, which took up the axe and drove the enemy onto Messina. I love the infantry because they are the underdogs. They are the mud, rain, frost, and wind boys. They have no comforts, and they learn to live even without the necessities. The frontline soldier I knew lived for months like an animal and was a veteran in the cruel, fierce world of death. Everything in his life was abnormal and unstable. He was filthy, dirty, ate if and when, slept on hard ground without cover. His clothes were greasy. He lived in a constant haze of dust, pestered by flies and heat, moving constantly, deprived of all the things that once meant stability, things such as walls, chairs, floors, windows, faucets, shelves, Coca-Colas, and the little matter of knowing that he would go to bed at night in the same place he had left in the morning. And in the end, they're the guys that wars can't be won without. I wish you could see just one of the pictures I have in my mind today. In this particular picture, I am sitting among clumps of grass on a steep and rocky hillside that we've just taken. A narrow path comes like a ribbon over a hill miles away, down a long slope, across a creek, up a slope, and over another hill. All along the length of this ribbon, there's now a thin line of men. For 4 days and nights, they have fought hard, eaten little, washed none, and slept hardly at all. Their nights have been violent with attack, fright, butchery, and their days sleepless and miserable with the crash of artillery. The men are walking. They're 50 feet apart for dispersal. Their walk is slow, for they are dead weary. As you can tell, even when looking at them from behind, every line and sag of their bodies speaks their inhuman exhaustion. On the shoulders and backs, they carry heavy steel tripods, machine gun barrels, boxes of ammunition. Their feet seem to sink into the ground from the overload they are bearing. They don't slouch. It is the terrible deliberation of each step that spells out their appalling tiredness. Their faces are black and unshaven. They're young men, but the grime and the whiskers and exhaustion make them look middle-aged. In their eyes, as they pass, is not hatred, not excitement, not despair, not the tonic of their victory. There's just the simple expression of being here, as though they had been here doing this forever, and nothing else. The line moves on, but it never ends. All afternoon, men keep coming around the hill and vanishing eventually over the horizon. It is one long, tired line of ant-like men. There is an agony in your heart. You almost feel ashamed to look at them. They're just guys from Broadway and Main Street, but you wouldn't remember them. They are too far away now. They are too tired. Their world can never be known to you. But if you could see them just once, just for an instant, you would know. No matter how hard people work back home, they are not keeping pace with these infantrymen. The war in Italy was tough. The land and the weather were both against us. and rained, and it rained. Vehicles bogged down, temporary bridges washed out. The fertile black valleys were knee-deep in mud. Thousands of men had not been dry for weeks. Other thousands lay at night in the high mountains, the temperature below freezing, the thin snow sifting over them. They dug into the stones and slept in little chasms, behind rocks and in half caves. They lived like men of prehistoric times. How they survived the dreadful winter at all was beyond us. The mountain fighting went on week after dreary week. The country was shockingly beautiful and just as shockingly hard to capture. Hills rose to high ridges of solid rock. We couldn't go around them because the Germans were up there, looking down. A platoon of Germans, well dug in on a high rock-spined hill, could hold out for a long time. So we had to go up and over. I hung around for a while with one of the mule pack outfits. There was an average of one mule packing outfit for every infantry battalion in the mountains. Every ounce of their supplies had to go up to them on the backs of mules and men. On an average night, the supplies would run something like this: 85 cans of water, 100 cases of K ration, 10 cases of D ration, 10 miles of telephone wire, 25 cases of grenades, rifle and machine gun ammunition, about 100 rounds of heavy mortar shells, one radio, 2 telephones, 4 cases of first aid packets, sulfa drugs. The packers would cram their pockets with cigarettes for the boys on top. Also cans of Sterno so they could heat some coffee once in a while. Mules took it the first third of the way. Men took it the last bitter 2/3 because the trail was too steep even for mules. Their most tragic cargo was mail. Every night they would tack up sacks of mail. Every night they'd bring a large portion of it back down. The recipients would have been killed or wounded the day their letters came. On the lone, man-killing climb above the end of the mule trail, they used anywhere from 20 to 300 men a night. And they rang in cooks, truck drivers, clerks, and anybody else they could lay their hands on. The mule packs would leave the olive groves in bunches of 20, starting just after dark. Soldiers were posted within shouting distance of each other all along the trail to keep the mule packs from getting lost in the dark. Those guides, everybody who thought he was having a tough time in this war should know about them. They were men who had fought through a long and bitter battle at the top of the mountain. For more than a week, they'd been far up there, perched behind rocks in the rain and the cold, eating cold K rations, sleeping without blankets, scourged constantly with artillery and mortar shells, fighting and ducking and growing more and more weary, seeing their comrades wounded one by one and taken down the mountain. Finally, sickness and exhaustion overtook most of those who were left, so they were sent back down the mountain under their own power to report to the medics there and then go to a rest camp. It took most of them the better part of a day to get 2/3 of the way down, so sore were their feet, so weary their muscles. And then, when actually in sight of their haven of rest and peace, they were stopped and pressed into guide service because there just wasn't anybody else to do it. So there they stayed on the mountainside, alongside the trail, for at least 3 additional days and nights that I know of, shouting in the darkness to guide the mules. And they did it without complaining. The human spirit is an astounding thing. I want to tell you what the opening of the second front entailed, so that you can know and appreciate and forever be humbly grateful to those, both dead and alive, who did it for you. In invasion parlance, the day a force strikes a new country is called D-Day. And the time it hits the beach is H-hour. Beach landings are planned to a schedule that is set far ahead of time. They have to be timed in order for everything to mesh. Elements of the assault force break through quickly and push on inland, attacking the most obvious enemy strong points, attacking gun positions from behind within a matter of minutes after the first men hit the beach. The following waves of troops standing off the beach, ready to land at the right moment. I have always been amazed at the speed called for in these plans. Schedules will call for engineers to land at H-hour plus 2 minutes, service troops at H-hour plus 30 minutes, and even for press censors to land at H-hour plus 75 minutes. But in the attack on my special portion of the beach, the toughest spot of all, incidentally, the schedule didn't hold. We were at sea for a much longer time than it would ordinarily take to make the Byline journey from England to France. The English Channel was crammed with forces going both ways. I didn't arrive on the beachhead until the morning after D-Day, after our first wave of assault troops had hit the shore. It seemed to me a pure miracle that we ever took the beach at all. Our troops faced such odds that getting ashore was like my whipping Joe Louis down to a pulp. Facing us were more enemy troops than we had in our assault waves. They had 4 men on shore for every 3 men we had approaching the shore. The Germans were dug into positions they'd been working on for months. 100-foot bluff, a couple hundred yards back from the beach, had great concrete gun emplacements built right into the hilltop, opening to the sides instead of the front, making it hard for naval fire from the sea to reach them. They could shoot parallel with the shore and cover every foot of it for miles. They had hidden machine gun nests on the forward slopes with crossfire taking in every inch of the beach. The advantages were all theirs, the disadvantages all ours. And yet, we got on. Now, the only way to take a beach is to face it and keep going. It's costly at first, but it's the only way. If the men are pinned down, dug in, and out of action, they might as well not be there at all. The first crack in the beach defenses was accomplished by terrific and wonderful naval gunfire, which knocked out the big emplacements. Destroyers ran right up into shallow water and had it out, point blank, with the big guns ashore. Our men stood up and went through and took that beach, those units that were so battered and went through such hell, pushed it on inland without rest, their spirits high. In the light of retrospection, we called it a miracle that they ever got on at all or were able to stay on. The men who did it were men of the 1st and 29th Divisions. Now, they suffered casualties, and yet, considering the entire beachhead assault, our total casualties in driving that wedge into the continent of Europe were only a fraction of what our commanders had been prepared to accept. By the time we got there, the beaches had been taken. The fighting had moved a couple miles inland. All that remained was some sniping and artillery fire, the occasional startling blast of a mine geysering brown sand into the air, and a gigantic and pitiful litter of wreckage along miles of shoreline. The awful waste and destruction of war has always been one of its outstanding features to those who are in it. Anything and everything is expendable. I walked for 1.5 miles along the water's edge. I walked slowly, for the detail on that beach was infinite. The wreckage was vast and startling. A mile out from the beach, there were tanks and trucks and boats at the bottom of the water, swamped by overloading, hit by shells, or sunk by mines. Most of their crews were lost. There were trucks half tipped over and swamped, partly sunken barges, the angled-up corners of jeeps, small landing craft, half submerged. On the beach itself were all kinds of wrecked vehicles, tanks that had only just made the beach before being knocked out, jeeps that had burned to a dull gray, big derricks on caterpillar treads that didn't quite make it. There were half-tracks carrying office equipment that had been made into a shambles by a single shell hit, their interiors still holding the useless equipage of smashed typewriters, telephones, office files. There was another, more human litter, the strewn personal gear that would never be needed again by those who fought and died to give us our entrance into Europe. It extended in a thin little line like a high water mark along the beach. There in a jumbled row from mile on mile were soldiers' packs, socks, shoe polish, sewing kits, diaries, Bibles, hand grenades. There were the latest letters from home, with the address neatly razored out, one of the security precautions enforced before the boys embarked. There were toothbrushes and razors and snapshots of families back home staring up at you from out of the sand. There were pocketbooks and metal mirrors, extra trousers, bloody abandoned shoes. There were broken-handled shovels, portable radios smashed beyond recognition, mine detectors twisted and ruined. There were torn pistol belts, canvas water buckets, first aid kits, jumbled heaps of life belts. I picked up a pocket Bible with a soldier's name in it, put it in my jacket. I carried it half a mile or so, and then put it back down on the beach. I don't know why I picked it up, or why I put it back down again. Soldiers carry strange things ashore with them. In every invasion, you'll find at least one soldier hitting the beach at H hour with a banjo slung over his shoulder. The most ironic piece of equipment marking our beach, this beach of first despair and then victory, was a tennis racket that some soldier had brought along. It lay lonesomely on the sand, clamped in its rack, not a string broken. Always, in every invasion, there are dogs. There was a dog still on the beach, pitifully looking for his masters. He barked appealingly to every soldier who approached, trotted eagerly along with him for a few feet, and then, sensing himself unwanted in all the haste, he would run back to wait in vain at his empty boat. I stepped over the form of one youngster whom I thought dead. But when I looked down, I saw that he was only sleeping. He was very young and very tired. He lay on one elbow, his hand suspended in the air about 6 inches from the ground, and in the palm of his hand, he held a large, smooth rock. I stood and looked at him for a long time. He seemed, in his sleep, to hold that rock lovingly, as though it were his last link with the vanishing world. Now, I have no idea at all why he went to sleep with the rock in his hand, or what kept him from dropping it once he was asleep. It was just one of those little things without explanation that a person remembers for a long time. The strong swirling tides of the Normandy coast shifted the contours of the sandy beach as they moved in and out. They carried soldiers' bodies out to sea, and later they returned them. They covered corpses with sand, and then, in their whims, they uncovered them. I stepped around what seemed to be a couple of pieces of driftwood sticking up out of the sand. But they weren't driftwood. They were a soldier's 2 feet. The toes of his GI shoes pointed toward the land that he had come so far to see, and which he saw so briefly. On the beach lay sufficient men and mechanism for a small war. Expended. They were gone forever now. And yet, we could afford it. We could afford it because we had our toehold. We were on. And behind us were enormous replacements. Over and around this long, thin line of personal anguish, men and equipment were flowing from England in such a gigantic stream that it made the waste on the beachhead seem like nothing at all. Really, nothing at all. Standing out there on the water was the greatest armada man has ever seen. Fresh men were rushing vast supplies to keep our armies pushing on into France. You simply could not believe the collection of ships waiting to unload. It lay thick and clear to the far horizon, and on beyond it spread out and was miles wide. A couple hundred yards back on the beach was a high bluff. From there, you could see far up and down the beach in a spectacular crow's nest view. We had a tent hospital up there and a barbed wire enclosure for prisoners of war. I noticed a group of freshly taken German prisoners. They had not yet been put into the prison cage. They were just standing there, a couple of doughboys guarding them with Tommy guns. The Germans were looking out to sea. That same sea that for months and years had been so safely empty before their gaze. Now they stood staring, almost as if in a trance. They didn't say a word to each other. The expression on their faces was something forever unforgettable. In it was the final, horrified acceptance of their doom. The average American found the climate of Normandy abominable. We had about one nice day for 3 bad days. On the nice days, the sky was clear blue, the sun was out, and everything seemed wonderful, except that there was still a hidden chill in the air. And in our tent or under a shade tree, we were cold. On the bad days, the whole universe was dark. It drizzled or sprinkled, and often a cold wind blew. We needed lights in our tents at noontime, and our bones and hearts were miserable. The most wrecked town I saw was Saint-Sauveur-le-Vicomte, known simply as Saint-Sauveur. Its buildings were gutted and leaning, its streets were choked with rubble. Vehicles drove over the top of it. Out at the edge of town, the bomb craters were so immense that whole houses could have been put into them. The place looked exactly like World War I pictures of Verdun. A veteran of the last war pretty well summed up the 2 wars when he said, "This is just like the last war, only the holes are bigger." The fantastic eruption of mass joy when Paris was liberated floored most of us. I felt totally incapable of reporting it. It was so big, I didn't know where to start or what to say. The words you put down sounded feeble to the point of asininity. I was not alone. I heard a dozen other correspondents say the same thing. Many of us feel that we have failed to present adequately the brightest, loveliest story of our time. Maybe because for so long we have been so unused to anything bright. From 2 in the afternoon until darkness around 10, Americans in Paris were kissed and hauled and mauled by friendly mobs until we hardly knew where we were. Everybody kissed us. Little children, old women, grown-up men, beautiful girls. Paris seemed to have all the beautiful girls we'd always heard it had. The women have an art of getting themselves up fascinatingly. They dress in riotous colors in this lovely warm season. Their hair is done crazily. And when the flag-draped holiday streets are packed with Parisians, the color makes everything else in the world seem gray. As one soldier remarked, the biggest thrill in getting to Paris is to see people in bright summer clothes again. They jumped and squealed and pushed in a frenzy. If our jeep stopped, we were swamped immediately. They pinned flags and badges all over you. Amateur cameramen took pictures. Gigantic masses of waving and screaming humanity clapped their hands as though applauding a performance in a theater. We smiled back until we had set grins on our faces. We waved until our arms gave out and then just waggled our fingers. We shook hands until our hands were bruised and scratched. Those who couldn't reach us threw kisses at us, and we threw kisses back. The kissing and shouting and autographing and applauding were almost overwhelming. The pandemonium of a free and lovable Paris reigned again. It was wonderful to be there. As usual, those Americans most deserving of seeing Paris, the fighting soldiers, will be the last ones to see it, if they ever do. Only one infantry regiment and one reconnaissance outfit actually came into Paris, and they passed through quickly and went on with their war. But that's the way things are in this world. This last chapter is being written in the latter part of August 1944 under an apple tree in a lovely green orchard in the interior of France. The war in France has been especially vicious because it was one of the last stands of the enemy. The end is inevitable. It cannot be put off for long. The German is beaten, and he knows it. It will be odd when at some given hour the shooting stops and everything suddenly changes again. It will be odd to drive down an unknown road without that little knot of fear in your stomach. Odd not to listen with animal-like alertness for every distant sound. Odd to have your spirit released from the perpetual weight of fear and death and dirt and noise and anguish. For some of us, the war has already gone on too long. Our feelings have been wrung and drained. They cringe from the effort of coming alive again. Even the approach of the end seems to have brought little inner elation. It has brought only a tired sense of relief. We have won because of many things. We've won partly because the enemy was weakened from our other battles. The victory here is the result of Russia and the Western Desert, and the bombings and the blocking of the sea, of Tunisia and Sicily and Italy. We must never forget or belittle those campaigns. We've won because we were audacious, because our men are brave, and because of many other things. Russia and England and the passage of time and the gift of nature's materials. We did not win it because destiny created us better than all other peoples. I hope that in victory we are more grateful than we are proud. The dead would not want us to gloat. Thousands of our men will soon be returning to you. They've been gone a long time. They have seen and done and felt things you cannot know. They will be changed. They will have to learn how to adjust themselves to peace, Last night, we had a violent electrical storm around our countryside. It was half over before we realized that the flashes and the crashings around us were not artillery, but plain old-fashioned thunder and lightning. It will be odd to hear only thunder again. You must realize that such little things as that are in our souls and will take time. And all of us together will have to learn how to reassemble our broken world into a pattern so firm and so fair that another great war cannot soon be possible. Now, to tell the simple truth, most of us in France don't pretend to know the right answer. Submersion in war does not necessarily qualify a man to be the master of the peace. All we can do is fumble and try once more. Try out of the memory of our anguish. And be as tolerant with each other as we can.